The first one, we're really going to use a kind of a nested story structure. So the outer layer is about our collaboration together, quite an interesting story there. And then the inner layer is really about mobile research and using visual content specifically in mobile research. So those are the things we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing is that our journey started almost exactly a year ago at this particular conference, right here in the same building. That's when Sami and I met. I'm from TNS, so I think a lot of people would know TNS, a large multinational, largely traditional research company. And Sami's from Glimpse. Then they were called Social Glimpse, and it's a Silicon Valley startup. And what we did back then a year ago was really we talked, we drank some beer, we talked some more, and very little of what we talked about was actually about work. Neither of us really thought about it at the time, but this was really the creation of that solid foundation, the foundation that we needed to be able to collaborate together. And that relationship, which started downstairs at the bar, was a key ingredient towards the success of our collaboration. So today what we're going to do is talk you through a little bit about what we ended up doing together, the experiment that we ended up doing, and underpinning the entire thing is this strong theme of collaboration, which we'll summarize at the end. So,
you want to click through, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So there was a great talk this morning that talked about a little bit about mobile research, and given that Glimpse was already firmly entrenched in the mobile space, and we had an interest in it, and we were starting to do more work around that area, we decided that that would be a good starting point for us for our experiment. And we looked at the research that was being done in this area, in this new area of mobile research, and we were quite amazed by the kind of mess that we saw. And so, as I said, the talk this morning talked a lot about the things that we see in mobile research, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But what we concluded was that the industry really needed to start designing mobile first. And we needed to think about essentially what was a mobile really good for, and what were the things that we could do with it, and how do we design with that in mind? So what is our best practice design? So yes, your mobile research needs to happen in really short chunks or short bursts. It needs to happen at convenient times. It should take advantage of times when these respondents are not busy with other things that shouldn't interrupt or intrude. And it's been shown that engaged respondents will give you better data, so we're not going to talk much about that. But above all, what we agreed on was that we should be focusing on visual content. We agreed that that should be the underlying basis for our collaboration. And we suggest to you that making use of visuals with your mobile devices is going to be the best way for you and best practice way of using mobile for research. So why is that? There are a couple of reasons. So the first reason is that visuals are really the new language of consumers. We take more photos and videos these days than ever before, and it's certainly true that a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. So there are entire social media platforms that are dedicated to visual content, to pictures, to videos, all of that, and even some of the older platforms like Twitter now being dominated by visual content. So we feel that these visuals have become a dominant means of communication, one that transcends language and cultural barriers. The next reason, the other reason that you really should be using visuals is because the devices that we're all carrying around are obviously being optimized for visuals. You've got much bigger screens, you've got much better cameras. And people just don't carry around dedicated cameras as much as they used to. I mean, think about yourself coming to this conference. I'm sure that not many of you brought a dedicated camera with you. And also, you think about something like the folder of pictures and videos that you have on your particular mobile device and how often you end up taking those out to share on those massive big screens that we're now carrying around. And I think about, I've recently got a puppy and I end up sharing with everybody what the, pictures of my puppy. So that's the way that we just kind of communicate with each other these days. But our industry, the market research industry, doesn't really know what to do with these pictures. They don't really know what to do with these videos. We sometimes take these images and use them to add to our research, to add flavor to our research, but mostly we use them qualitatively at best. some market research practitioners don't even know how to really effectively use it qualitatively, let alone move into the quantitative space. And that's where we think the real opportunity is to move the analysis of all of these kinds of content into a more quantitative space. And really what that says is that mobile gives us this opportunity to create some blurred lines between, and to forward the blurring of these lines between qualitative and quantitative. It also helps us to bring together these two, until now, distinct areas of research and marketing. And we would suggest that our clients in the future are not going to care whether it's called research or if it's called marketing. They're not going to care whether that research is following some kind of archaic code. But what they will care about is whether the information is helpful to their mission and whether it helps them as a brand or a company. So, to our proof of concept, or our experiment, there were a couple of things that we did. So there are three distinct pieces, starting on your left-hand side and moving towards the right. The first piece, so we decided to use some work that we'd already done, that TNS had done around Super Bowl, around the Super Bowl adverts. And the first piece, a colleague of mine and a team that I work with, did a bunch of social media analysis. And they tried to understand what mentions were happening around the Super Bowl adverts. So there were millions of tweets that were analyzed around that. And we found a bunch of the adverts that were mentioned most around that research. The second piece was using the TNS approach to communications evaluation. So we used our framework and we used our approach, and we tried to understand some of those most mentioned adverts, what made them really good or bad, and how could we try to understand those ads. And then the last piece was what we call here a visual dialogue, and that was something that the glimpse approach, which Sami will explain to you in a second, was aiming to capture. So just very, very briefly, what we saw in the social media data was that the Budweiser Lost Dog really dominated all mentions. It dominated the entire landscape around that. But it wasn't really telling us a lot around content, about what was going on in those ads. So we used our communications approach to try and understand that, and we saw that the Microsoft ad scored really well on relevance. We saw that the McDonald's ad scored really well on novelty. That was the one where you're paying with loving. But when we came to the Budweiser ad, what we saw was that it was doing pretty well at making people emotive. So people were crying about this lost dog, but it wasn't really seen as relevant. So that's where we really wanted to try and understand a bit more about what was relevant. And this is where I'll hand over to Sami.
Cool. Thanks, Adhil. And Adhil forgot to mention, we talked about this, that he's actually from South Africa. So it made the collaboration between us all that much more fun, I guess, is how you just describe that, at least from a logistics perspective. So I have the fun task of taking you through what we call, what Adhil mentioned, what we call the visual dialogue methodology. And true to the, to sort of it being an analogy for how you actually converse in real life, you do it through words, right, when you have a conversation, and here you do it through visuals. So it's as simple as that. We enable researchers, brands, to go out there, start with text-based questions, or even video prompts for these conversations, or even image-based prompts for these conversations, and gather from mobile respondents in the moment of truth what we call our response unit in our system called a glimpse. And a glimpse is a combination of some sort of visual media, again, a picture or a short video, and short text, the size of a tweet, let's say. And then, of course, we go through, this is where our technology kicks in, and we start doing things like machine coding, and we have a learning algorithm that will start doing tagging of images. But there's a step in here that is sort of a nuanced step that's important. When we gather these glimpses from the crowd, we then take them and then we publish them out to a broader audience. We call them our evaluators, and we get them to rate and rank and comment on the visuals that come through. And with that, we're able to do things like crowd resonance scores and understanding and analysis of crowd resonance. So for this particular case, we actually started with 2 conversations in our system, right? First, targeted around emotion. So we asked, what's one emotion that Budweiser evokes in you? And we thought that was best sort of understood through, again, this visual language. And then the second one was where our conversation prompt had the commercial itself, and we asked people to tell us about why this lacked relevance, or in other words, tell us what would make this more relevant. So these were the two conversations we led with. And it came back with, we came back with a whole bunch of amazing qualitative insights. And to Adhil's point, this was sort of the first step of the analysis. We can get things like, what you would get in traditional ideation, but with a whole lot of color and insight to them. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right, after all. So we got a whole bunch of qualitative insights, and similar to ideation, it's really the long tail of insights that really pop for you. So it's the things that you wouldn't guess if you just went into a room and said, well, how are people going to respond? Right? And that's sort of what we did in the qualitative aspect of this. But to Adhil's point, the key benefit was really around translating the data that we got into a quantitative analysis. And the way that we do this is, like I alluded to, we have the use of computer vision to do what I call the what tagging. It's basically going through images and understanding the contents of those images. So things like, this was an outdoor setting, or this was an indoor setting, or this was a car, or this was a house. So we get to tag all of these images with insights, essentially. And then we have the why tagging, which is done by a human. And we think that's very important. You have to go through and sort of analyze it from our human intelligence perspective as well. So we do the tagging of all of these images, and we come up with, quantitative things that look quantitative, in other words, to us, right? Like charts that tell us what are the insight occurrences that came up. And so in this particular case, going back to the study, we got a lot of people, these are things you could guess. A lot of people saying, well, I'm a dog lover, so this was totally relevant to me, no changes needed. I'm a cat lover, make it about a cat. Or, this was a beer commercial. You're a beer brand, there was not a mention of beer. Or this was run during the Super Bowl. There was no football going on in these commercials, right? On the other hand, and these were, in my opinion, some of the more obvious ones. The two that were less obvious were, I like summer settings. And when we got pictures back, you could actually tell what the sentiment of these people were. It was, hey, when I think of beer, I think of ice cold, refreshing, and it's always best in contrast to a summer setting. So put this in a summer setting. We thought that one was interesting. And my favorite is actually this one about, hey, there's not a lot of relevance in a farm or rural setting to me. I'm an urbanite, or I'm a suburbanite, right? And the interesting thing about that one, just coming back to the evaluation or the crowd resonance that we did analysis, that one actually scored really high on the crowd resonance. I think it only came back a couple times in actual visuals that we got somebody saying, hey, put it in a city, or something like that. But once we put it out to the crowd evaluation group, it scored extremely high. So these were some of the benefits that came back from the quantitative analysis as well. And so I would be lying if I told you that this was this was done and done. We did our job and we're done. There's a lot left to this technology behind visual analysis. And so that's the inspiration here. Automated visual analysis is good, but it's not perfect. And it's based on what I mentioned earlier, right? There's the what tagging, where you can actually get things like contents from pictures. And then there's the human layer, where we understand intent, insight, et cetera, from these images. Having said all of that, I do believe we have the computing power and capabilities in the next few years to start tackling the why out of machines as well. And so I'll end here by saying that we actually did something similar with social media. So we ran the exact same methodology I described, but we pulled images from hashtag searches on both Instagram and Twitter. And it works pretty much the same. I think the one thing from a practice perspective to note is that, and we're all researchers, so we sort of know this, but outcomes are dependent on how you ask a question. And in the social media world, we didn't really ask a question. It was sort of unsolicited data that people posted to their social feeds, and we did hashtag searches on that. So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing your visual analysis. I'm going to turn it back over to Adhil.
Great, thanks, Sami. So just to wrap up, we'll talk a little bit about the collaboration that we did. So some tips. We didn't start by comparing functionality or capabilities. We started by, as I said earlier, a couple of beers and some conversations around common ground. I think that's a really important part of collaboration. It's really hard if you're trying to collaborate with someone just because your companies should be able to work together. It makes it extremely hard to be able to work with someone that you don't necessarily like, for example. So we'd suggest that that's the more important part for you to focus on, certainly up front. One of the things we found, as Sami said, we're on opposite sides of the planet. It was kind of difficult. We're not working in the same office, so we do need to schedule regular update meetings up front. We found that as soon as we started doing that, we started pushing that work through a lot faster. And we know that life happens, so if you don't schedule those regularly, you're just not going to get stuff done. Another 2 points that I wanted to make, really. There is a hesitation, especially when you're working with people that are not part of your team or not part of your particular company, that sometimes you feel like if it's not ready yet or something that you're working on is not perfect. We're, as researchers, we tend to be perfectionists and we'd want to get everything completely perfect. I'd encourage you to share things even if it's not ready, even if it's not finished, because that's the only way you're going to really get collaboration going. And that's where we found, we were brainstorming, and every time we got together, we had, if some things changed and something, we went off on a slightly different track, but it actually helped us in the long run. So it made things made us get to the end destination quicker. And the last thing I think is really important is don't bite off more than you can chew. When we had our first conversation, there were so many things that we wrote down as potential avenues. And if we tried to do all of that, we would not be here today. So the only way that we were able to really get something that we could bring to the conference today was to make it very specific, think about the things that we can do and the things that each of our companies can do, and try to make it really sustainable and kind of easy. So that's all we have for you today. I think we've still got a couple of minutes for questions, so thank you very much for listening. Anybody want to know more? Lights are in our eyes.
Yeah.
No questions? Come on.
No? Cool.
Okay.
Well, catch us. We're going to be around the next couple of days. If anyone's interested, anyone else wants to collaborate for next year's conference, we're around.
Okay, thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers, then.